today's World Insight, as the UN conference COP25 draws to a close, how has it forged global climate action?
Well, we did it! We did it! We pulled it off, didn't we?
And Britain's Tory party was forced to win big in Parliament, a vote to get Brexit done.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN. I'm Michael Wong, standing in for Tian Wei. We begin today's program over in the Spanish capital of Madrid, where 2 weeks of UN climate negotiations have drawn to a close on Friday. So the question is, has this conference made any progress in stopping global warming? Well, before we get down to a talk on that, here are some of the highlights from this year's COP25.
To act or not to act, that is the question.
Time for action. There cannot be any excuses for not reaching agreements.
As the UN Climate Summit wrapped up in Madrid on Friday, observers said negotiators from 196 nations had largely failed to settle disputes over how carbon markets should work. They fell short of working on a reprieve for vulnerable nations. A deadlock remains despite pressures from inside and outside the negotiation rooms.
And we need to start treating this crisis like a crisis, and you can be a part of that, not only as an individual, but also as a small part of a big movement.
The COP25 comes on the heels of climate-related disasters across the planet, including unprecedented cyclones, deadly droughts, and record-setting heat waves. Scientists have amassed a mountain of evidence pointing to even more dire impacts on the near horizon.
And I'll have to say this, I cannot think of a single thing that has been studied in science about climate change that has come to the conclusion that it's not going to be as bad as we thought it was yesterday. It just keeps getting worse and worse as we learn more and more, because things are getting worse.
As the Trump administration is bent on pulling America out of the Global Climate Pact, American billionaire and Democratic presidential contender Michael Bloomberg came to Madrid and vowed to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement if he's elected president.
And we want the world to know that Americans are continuing to lead on climate change, even with a climate denier in the White House.
Madrid was seen as a crucial launchpad where countries could show goodwill before next year's COP26 summit in Glasgow.
Right, so how has COP25 shaped the climate agenda overall for our planet? Let's bring in our panelists. With us here in our Beijing studio is Ms. Wu Changhua. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Beijing Innovation Center. Also here in our Beijing studio is Professor Qi Ye of the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University. He's also the Director of the Institute of Public Policy over at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And over in Madrid, on the ground at COP25, we have invited Jennifer Morgan. Jennifer is the Executive Director of Greenpeace International. Welcome to you all on this very timely and very important topic. Ms. Wu, I want to start with you. From the first COP meeting over in Germany 25 years ago, in 1995, how do you think COP25 has changed the dialogue on global climate change?
There definitely has been a very interesting journey, and in the beginning I think we're mostly talking about how to manage the climate risk, trying to prevent climate disasters, crises. Now getting to where 25 years faster forward, we know we're already living in climate change, and we have to accelerate our actions on one side to mitigate emissions, and on the other side actually we have to learn how to adapt to climate change. And very importantly, I think the global community has agreed to come together and to really, look at the technology, finance, policy, and of course actions, deploy the actions and the technology solutions on the ground in order to make sure we catch up, not failing our future generation in a very bad manner.
Yeah, I mean, acceleration is going to be key, and next year we need to be implementing the Paris Agreement. Professor Qi, how optimistic are you in terms of how well we can implement this agreement come 2020, which is just a few weeks away?
I think there are certain things we can implement, but in general, I think that the problem for implementation is we have an overall goal, which is a 2 degree C, not to exceed 2 degrees Celsius for the temperature. But when it comes to implementation, we're implementing the so-called nationally determined contributions. It's really up to each different countries.
It's not binding.
It is not binding, right? It then depends on the countries. Some countries, they are taking this very seriously, and the implementation is expected to be good. And some other countries, they're not really taking this very seriously. That would be the problem. I think one of the sticking points for the COP25 is to see whether or not we can implement the Article 6, right? Coming up with the rules. I think that is very critical. And so far we have not heard any good news yet.
Article 6, the one you refer to in terms of pricing carbon around the world, that is
exactly
the stickler right now.
Exactly, right.
That's about the international carbon market mechanism, as we know, actually. So we had the Kyoto Protocol, we had a clean development mechanism, so we had a carbon market, and we call it market-based instrument that's sort of integrated in the global climate landscape there. Then what's next, right? We need to figure out how do we make sure there is going to be continuity of international market mechanism still there playing its role. In the meantime, the legacy issue, how to connect the CDM mechanism and the achievements, whatever has been achieved, and connect with the future mechanism.
Jennifer, I want to bring you into the conversation as well, because obviously the very big elephant in the room is the United States backing out of the Paris Agreement. How optimistic are you in terms of how well we can go forward with tackling climate change if the world's largest economy is not party right now to the Paris agreements?
Well, I think that it's very good that the Paris Agreement has moved forward. That's a beacon for multilateralism around the world, and you are seeing countries starting to implement in different levels of intensity. Obviously, the United States, as the world's largest historical emitter, has a responsibility and must come back into this agreement. But it's not as if there aren't things happening in the U.S. Right now on the ground, very large states moving forward. And I think that will assist as the U.S. moves forward in trying to come back in. But you know, the world can't wait for them. The world has to move forward. It shouldn't be held back by one country, especially when tackling climate change is such an economic opportunity, drives innovation, cleans up polluted air. There's lots of reasons why to act.
And this is why I think the Chinese delegation also at COP25 spoke about perhaps that the world does not want to see unilateralism when it comes to climate change issues. Well, China and the European Union at the COP25 have also banded together in meeting targets set in the Paris Agreement. That's despite, of course, some of the political and trade challenges that we are seeing around the world right now. Now, one European Commission executive certainly minced no words in stressing China's role in tackling climate change. Take a listen to this first.
Without China, there would be no Paris Agreement. China is one of the founding fathers, if I could call it that, of the Paris Agreement, which comes also with a responsibility to make it happen. And I still have the sense, when I talk to the Chinese delegation, that there is a strong feeling of responsibility also in China for the Paris Agreement. So let's work together. Let's show that the European Union and China jointly can make a success out of the Paris Agreement.
All right, let's continue our conversation on tackling climate change in the Paris Agreement. Professor Xi, I want to ask you, what do you think China's experience is on this front?
I think China has come a long way. From the very beginning, China was not very clear about, what's happening on the science, and then later, especially in the last couple of years, we have seen China has taken much more proactive steps and measures. And the speaker just talked about the Paris Agreement, and China has played a fundamental role. November 12th, when then President Obama, President Xi got together, they had joint announcement on climate change. That really set the very foundation for the Paris Agreement 1 year later. And China has also taken measures to tackle a lot of domestic problems like air pollution while doing that, and it has done so much work in mitigating the carbon emission and other greenhouse gas emissions. And China's the energy efficiency in the last 4 decades has been improving at 5% a year. So there is no other major economies has such very rapid improvement in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and for the last decade, China has been the greatest investor on renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, contributing to 30% to even 1/3 of the global investment in clean energy. I think there's so much that China has done, but like the speaker said, we need more. The world really needs to do more, and we need to do this together.
Well, one interesting statistic is that in 2018, last year, China really drastically reduced carbon emissions by per unit GDP of 45.8% from 2005 levels, and it's doing this from a developing economy standpoint, Ms. Wu.
Yes, that's part of the commitment and also part of the achievement China overall has achieved so far around the carbon intensity. This means the efficiency target and productivity target there. China has committed to the Paris Agreement. By 2030, we're going to achieve carbon intensity targets around 60 to 65% over the 2005 level. And also, if you look at renewable energy target, we're going to get at least 20% of the primary energy structure there. China is already on the track, and the 45.8%, that's the number just announced recently, showing China is already overachieving its target. So there should be no problem, I think, in terms of China's continued commitment and the steady, fast efforts there. But as Professor Chi mentioned here, global level, and we are literally on the path towards a 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise compared to pre-industrial, level, right? And the target is, say, within 2 degrees Celsius there. So how do we make sure we build upon the current efforts, achievements, and really elevate further the commitments and accelerate the actions in order to be better aligned with the Paris Agreement? That remains the biggest puzzle on the table today.
Yeah, well, I mean, the goal is we don't want to see average global temperatures rise by 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. We are already at 1.1 degrees centigrade in terms of global temperature rises, and this is only 2019, 2020. A long way to go before the end of the century. Jennifer, though, perhaps some momentum in terms of tackling climate change can be from youth climate activists. What are you seeing on that front? Are they breathing new life into this conversation, you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think the youth activists around the world and here in Madrid as well have brought a very clear sense of the urgency. They are looking at a future that would be completely chaotic, dominated by these impacts unless countries come together and commit to actually increasing what their actions are. And here I think China plays a very important role, a bridge between the developed country and the poor countries of the world. And so we're looking all to hopefully have China play a leading role in the final hours here to respond to the science and the youth. Working with Europe, as was noted there, I think that is one of the most important dynamics moving forward into 2020, so that China can fulfill, it's such a beacon for multilateralism, and we need their voice here as well.
On that point, actually, I think I definitely echo what Jennifer has said, but there is the other side of the story. How much a country can really take on, right? And I think as we follow the news discussion, in Madrid, and there's a lot of expectations about China playing a more significant role in terms of bringing everyone together. I think China definitely has an important role to play, but it cannot be just left to China itself. China cannot possibly interfere with many other countries' internal affairs, political landscape, whatever. This really is a collective effort. We need everyone to be together in order to do so. Just another point to add, actually, early on, I think the colleague from Europe basically said, if you look at the success of the Paris Agreement, China is the biggest contributor. To be fair to the Obama administration, I think it's both because U.S., China, EU, the larger players coming together that really contributed to the success of the Paris Agreement. I don't think it's fair to the others by overemphasizing the role of China. By saying that, I say definitely China has had a very important role to play and will continue to play. I don't feel comfortable in terms of distorting the picture in a way, the over expectations on China. I don't think it's totally fair.
Jennifer, it seems like you wanted to add to that.
I think that it is. Yeah, thanks. It's hard when you're far away. I think it certainly is a collective effort and something that developed countries should be leading. The European Union's Green Deal that was released this week is a very systemic approach to that, and I think that China and the EU could work together. I think the vulnerable countries, though, here are asking of, further action, and China belongs in that group, has been an ally to the vulnerable countries over time, and needs to drive forward on that. Key role, but certainly not the only one. And working with others, I think, hopefully we can get out of here with something that gives some hope to young people.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Chi, I want to get your take on perhaps another milestone as we tackle climate change, 2050, trying to achieve carbon neutrality by that year. How optimistic are you on that front, given where climate talks are going right now?
There is certainly a need for the 2050 neutrality, carbon neutrality, but we have to look at the historical development of that. The first time when the target was proposed was June 2015, only 4 years ago, when G7 leaders get together. They were talking about to decarbonize the world economy by the end of this century, right? Then that was a very different goal. And after the Paris Agreement, we're talking about the later half. And after the 1.5C, IPCC 1.5C report came up, then this new goal was set. Within the last 4 years, we have been moving the target closer and closer. So that is what is really needed. But the reality is that target is really, really hard to achieve. Not just for China, even for the developed countries, they're trying very hard. UK is by now perhaps the leading one who made legislation to achieve that. But look, UK led the Industrial Revolution many, many years ago, right? Then, many, many years ahead of China and ahead of the developed countries. So we have to look at the reality. That is a very, honorable target and is what really needed to avoid a lot of disasters. But the reality is it takes just a daunting effort, the amount of effort to achieve that.
Yeah, I echo that, but I probably would also look a little bit more positively about the future, particularly looking at the technology revolution and around the energy, around the materials at this moment. Honestly, I think 2050 carbon neutrality target goal is really good corresponding to what the scientists are telling us, right? There's a sense of urgency, and I really applaud what EU has done this week, and by really putting the target to 2050 carbon neutral, as EU, as a collective sort of economic bloc to do that. And I think build upon the expertise, the capability, technologies, and also level of ambitions there, I think EU is going to make the case. We're going to learn from them tremendously. And in the meantime, I think EU, China definitely can work very, very close together. So the Green Deal or New Green Deal is not just a EU agenda. I think China's ecological civilization is very much aligned with that. Even in the US, if you look at a lot of Congress people and particularly the younger generations actually of the political leaders at the Congress now, they're also advocating Green New Deal. So I'm hoping somehow, say, yes, on one side it's very challenging, but on the other side, if you look at the US, EU, China, really the three largest economies coming together, aligned actually this Green Deal, I think very possibly we're going to figure out actually how to create a grand new pie in terms of a grand new economic sort of paradigm, so that we'll be able to really shift the global economy towards the right direction, towards carbon neutrality by 2050. And in order to do that, to achieve that, I think 2030 is another milestone, which is down the road in 10 years' time, meaning globally we do need to halve the emissions by 2030, which is another more immediate, more urgent goal we need to achieve. We need to figure that out as soon as possible.
But there are so many countries right now still relying on coal as a primary fuel source. The legacy infrastructure that is built into a country's energy system, I mean, that's going to be really difficult. But you're saying technology, though, the technology is there. I guess maybe it's just the political will, whether or not national governments want to do this.
The policy incentives, policy goals, and particularly to leverage investment, make sure we get enough finance actually to be invested in the new infrastructure, new technologies, so that we'll be able to move things, shift the things together towards carbon neutral future.
Jennifer, what do you think? Carbon neutrality 2050.
Absolutely. I mean, I would just add, carbon neutrality 2050 is not only what we have to do for the science, but it is also the way to create and modernize economies. And I think that one reason why the European Union is going in this direction is because it sees that. It sees ways of innovating. It sees the markets there for renewable energy, where China has also been a leader, but also in the agricultural sector, in mobility. So it really is about a green race into the future. And I think that getting that in place, and those benefits, if you start calculating in the costs of the air pollution to people's health, and you start looking at this potential stranded assets of continuing to invest in coal when you know you need to go in this other direction, then the economics and the science come together, and that's the way that we need to also work together to have people come with us. China has been really done good work on reducing coal over the years. Last year there was a slight uptick. They need to double down and make sure that comes back down again, and I think then that can really send those signals. But there's tremendous opportunity here, and when I'm in Beijing, that's what I hear too, that smelling that out and seeing that and taking that forward.
Okay, we are going to leave it there. We'll certainly keep our eyes and ears peeled in terms of what kind of final agreement we can get at COP25 over in Madrid in a few hours' time. But thank you so much for your insights on this topic, Ms. Wu Changhua, Professor Qi Ye, as well as Jennifer Morgan over for us in Madrid. Thank you to you all. You're watching World Insight. Still to come here on our program. Britain's Tory party won big in Parliament. A vote to get Brexit done. Is that in the cards? That's up for discussion next, right after the break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight here on CGTN. I'm Michael Wong, sitting in for Tian Wei. Next, we turn to the United Kingdom, where Boris Johnson's Conservative Party won over 360 seats. That is well past that 326 seat needed for a majority. It's also the Tories' biggest win in Parliament since the heyday of Margaret Thatcher back in the 1980s. So, with this new mandate, is Prime Minister Johnson and his pledge to deliver Brexit by the end of January on track?
Election, your voice has been heard, and about time too. Because we politicians have squandered the last 3 years, 3.5 years, in squabbles about Brexit. We've even been arguing about arguing and about the tone of our arguments. I will put an end to all that nonsense, and we will get Brexit done on time by the 31st of January. No ifs, no buts, no maybes.
So what does a victory for the UK's Conservative Party mean for Britain? In London, we have Ian Begg, a professorial research fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Brussels, we have Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center over in Brussels. And with us right here in our Beijing studio is Professor Cui Hongjian, the director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome to you all. Ian, I want to begin with you because this is certainly a big win for the Conservatives, the largest majority since Margaret Thatcher's time. Is this indeed a clear mandate to actually now, finally, to get Brexit done?
It's certainly a clear mandate for Boris Johnson. I think it's a personal triumph for him. I had a lot of misgivings about whether he would achieve it, but he clearly has. He's gambled big and he's won. What this will mean for Brexit is that the first stage of Brexit, withdrawing from the EU, is almost a cast iron certainty for the end of January next year. What will happen next is that Boris Johnson will present all the relevant legislation in the House of Commons. He'll push it through very rapidly, and we will see that decision taken which will enable the UK to leave the European Union on the 31st of January or even before. What it doesn't do is solve all the second stages of Brexit, which is the future relationship between the UK and the EU. So in that sense, no, Brexit is not done.
All right. Fraser, to you, because certainly, again, like Ian said, this is only the first step in Brexit. What are you hearing right now in Brussels in terms of Boris Johnson taking this majority over in Parliament? He has now, of course, a clear mandate. The EU now saying there's more clarity, but what more are you hearing in Brussels?
Well, two important things. Firstly, I think people here in Brussels welcome that there is a government with a solid majority in the UK that can get things done. Although, as Professor Begg said, getting Brexit done is only part one. The next part is the most difficult part. And this is the second concern in Brussels. To what extent will Boris seek to align the UK closely to EU rules and regulations? And to what extent will he drift off towards Trump's type of economic system? Trump is obviously welcomed Boris's victory, and there is some concern here in Brussels that Boris will try and take the UK more towards a deregulated system, and that will certainly cause problems with the EU.
So, Mr. Cui, after Britain actually leaves the EU, of course, trade negotiations will begin. How certain are we, or how certain are you, perhaps, that a deal would be in place to get Britain out of the EU by January 2021, and then also a trade deal perhaps being done by the end of next year, which is really, really quite ambitious, I feel?
Indeed, after this election, we can understand maybe clear, I mean, for this scenario, or for this future for Brexit, even earlier than the end of next January. But of course, still, I think there are some, maybe still some uncertainties, even it's not so big. For example, how about this time for the votes in Parliament? Because we know so far, not yet. I mean, for the Conservative Party, they do have a very strong consensus on the Brexit itself. Another issue, maybe another difficult issue, is how about the response from the Scottish side. As we know, the SNP also own some more seats in this election. So even before this election, the Madam Sturgeon, claimed that she will try to, push forward this independent, vote for this Scotland. So what will happen for this engagement? I mean, between the central government and the local government. Another issue, yes, very difficult issue for this. Deal, I mean, especially trade deal negotiation between the UK and the EU. So still, I think that there are a lot of homework need to be done by Mr. Johnson.
Ian, so Mr. Cui was just mentioning there the very big victory that the Scottish National Party saw over in Scotland. Do you think then perhaps a second Scottish referendum is in the works, given the SNP's strong performance up north?
Well, you realise that in Fraser and I, you're talking to two Scots, so we'll have strong opinions on this. The first answer is that yes, there's going to be a push from the Scottish executive to request a second referendum, but so far Boris Johnson, in the run-up to the election, had said no, he's not going to allow a second referendum because he regards the one that took place in 2014 as being enough for the time being. I think in addition that the idea of a Scottish referendum is being pushed by the nationalists partly because they are in a political difficulty of their own. They won the election in Scotland, yes, but their record in government has not been very strong, and they also fear what's going to come in the new year, which is a trial for sexual offences of Nicola Sturgeon's predecessor, which is going to taint the Scottish nationalist image. So what I expect is that over the next week you will see very strong demands from Scotland for a second referendum, and equally strong reactions from Boris Johnson and London saying, no, we're not going to give it to you. So it's going to be a very dramatic week probably in that aspect of the politics, but I expect the outcome to be not an agreement on a Scottish referendum.
Ian, what about other campaign promises made by both the Conservative and the Labour Party? Of course, the Tories focusing a lot on Brexit, but what about some of the social issues from Labour's side? Is that still going to matter going forward?
Yes, so all parties in Britain always have to say they're going to spend more money on our National Health Service, and the likely outcome of the election is going to be that there will be an easing of public expenditure constraints even by the Conservative Party, more money being spent. They were rather cautious in their promises, and that's one reason that Boris Johnson probably did better than might have been expected, because he didn't try to bet the bank on everything happening very quickly. I would expect some increases in health spending, some increases in other areas of spending, but nothing too dramatic.
Fraser, over to you. What do you think happens now to the Labour Party? Jeremy Corbyn, of course, saying that he will not be stepping in as leader in the next election going forward for the UK.
Well, there's going to be an almighty civil war, because the two wings of the party obviously don't agree on what went wrong. For the Corbynistas, they feel that this was a media conspiracy, that they get all mixed up in the Brexit debate, and that they had just got their message across a little bit stronger, all would have been well. Now, I think the majority, if you like, the centre-right of the party say no. On the doorstep, we were getting a lot of hostility towards you, Mr Corbyn. You must go as soon as possible, and we must drag the Labour Party back to the centre ground, because after all, that is where Labour won its 3 elections under Tony Blair in the early parts of this century. So I think there's going to be a pretty strong civil war. The problem is the Momentum left-wing group are very well entrenched throughout the party machinery, so it's not going to be an easy fight to get a centre-right candidate, but they certainly need one, in my view, if they're going to try and get inroads into that large Tory majority at the next election.
Professor Tory, back to you here in Beijing. How long do you think it would be before business as usual in the UK? Again, this is only the first step in Brexit. There still needs to be lots of trade negotiations for the UK to actually exit out of the EU, and the uncertainty surrounding all of this, especially for businesses, is still quite high.
Yes, if we can call the Brexit as a process, I think this the result of the election and at the end of next January, just the first half of the process, or maybe just the end of the beginning, because we know there will be a very, very difficult negotiation between EU and Britain on this we call it the future relations, especially the trade deal. As we know, so far, according to my understanding, they do have a very big difference. I mean, at the starting point. For example, for UK, it tried to get something more, maybe benefits from the negotiation with the EU, because it will be very useful for Johnson, to tell this British people that we did correct the thing. But of course, on the European Union side, and it's difficult to get some more compromise, to give some more benefits to EU without the membership of the European Union, because once it happens, it's difficult for EU to persuade its member states that the Brexit is a bad thing. So I think so far, yes, very, very difficult thing. And of course, even maybe in the next year or maybe more than that time, I think most of the British people, they still suffer from this so-called process.
Well, Mr. Sweet, what do you think this means for China-UK relations going forward? Because once the UK exits the EU, it will try and strike FTAs with many of the largest economies in the world. Can we expect a UK-China FTA in the works going forward?
Indeed. I think as we understand that even earlier, before this time, that the British government tried to get a promise from Chinese side to have this FTA negotiation as soon as possible, especially shortly after the UK leave from European Union. But of course, I think for China should take some more cautious attitude for any requirement from UK, because China need to take the balance between the market in European Union and also the market in UK. But of course, I think it will give some more opportunity in future for China and the UK and maybe some other economies, because as we know, once UK try to get some more momentum for its economic development, certainly, maybe Mr. Johnson and his colleagues will try to release some more favorable, environment for trade and investment in future.
And on that note, Professor Begg, the EU and the US both saying they're ready to strike a new trade deal with London. Does that mean, though, necessarily the British economy is out of the woods right now?
Well, I think what we might expect to see in the short term is something of a Brexit bounce to the economy, because the dark cloud that's been hanging over the economy for 2 years now, since the year after the referendum, has been the uncertainty about where Brexit was heading. We now have the quasi-certainty that it's going to happen, at least the first stage of it, at the end of January, and that will unlock some of the investment that's been pent up. That's going to be favourable for the economy. Now, we do have the global downside risks that might mitigate that, but still I would say that that's going to be favourable for the UK. Then we get into the negotiation of the future relationship. Now, that's going to be much more contentious, because I don't believe it can be done within 12 months. I think Boris Johnson will probably use his huge majority and no longer being shackled by his right wing to say, well, okay, we should take this more carefully, we need to extend the transition. So for the next 2 or 3 years, I would expect the British economy still to be quite closely tied to the EU, and then we will see what the future relationship is.
And after 2 to 3 years, Fraser, what do you think that means for the City of London? The City of London, of course, very closely tied with the European continent, but once the UK actually leaves the European Union for good, does that mean the City of London and its competitiveness could really fall to some of the continental heavyweights, such as Frankfurt, for example?
Slightly, but many of the big banks have already taken mitigating steps and set up offices in Dublin, Frankfurt, Paris and so on, because they want to continue using the so-called passporting rights to ensure that they can make use of all the sort of euro clearing facilities that they benefit from now. I think there's a smaller group in London in the hedge fund sector who really do want to see Britain break away and go for a sort of America-style or Singapore in terms of economy. But they're not a majority, and it's going to be a real balancing act for Boris Johnson to try and chart a way between those on the right wing of his party who want this kind of road, and the new MPs representing now large swathes of the north of England who want a more sort of social care policy, more spending on infrastructure, hospitals and protection of jobs, particularly the car industry in the Midlands. So it's going to be a very difficult balancing act over the coming year. And on relations with the EU, the UK is not in the strongest position, because from January they will effectively be out of the EU with no voice, but at the same time subject to all the EU rules and regulations. So it's not a very good place to be when you're negotiating.
On the City of London issue, Professor Begg, I saw you shaking your head there. You want to jump in and comment on that?
I think the point to make about the City of London is that it is the one global centre in Europe. So it's up here. Frankfurt, Paris, Amsterdam and so on are in the second tier, and they're not overnight going to take over what the City of London does. In any case, the City of London has been very good over the centuries at reinventing itself for the global role. So although there is the likelihood of some loss of business to other European centres, it's not going to be dramatic. And I would hesitate to write off the City of London at this stage.
And Professor Cui, over to you. In terms of how China's relationship, this dynamism between Brussels and London, how that's going to shape up once Brexit wraps up, what do you think that might look like?
I think firstly, because China regards the Brussels and London as a very important partners. So I think certainly China will try to push forward this cooperation with both two sides. But of course, I think the Brexit will give some new format for these relations between China and Europe. So I think China now, of course, we will try to take advantage of this change. For example, maybe China will continue its cooperation with UK on financial and service industry. At the same time, of course, China also takes the value of the bigger market in a single market, I mean European Union. So maybe in the near future that China and the UK and the EU, they can push for the kind, or maybe develop a kind of a new style, new type of kind of trilateral cooperation. I think once it happens, it will be beneficial not only for China, UK, and the European Union.
And Fraser, the last word over to you. Mr. Cui there was just talking about perhaps a new trilateral cooperation between China, the UK, and the EU. What do you think about the prospects for that?
The European market's far more important for China than the UK market on its own. So I think the Chinese government will concentrate on securing a good bilateral investment agreement and hopefully in the next year before President Xi Jinping comes to Europe for a big summit in Germany next year. I think that is really going to be the priority for China. And of course, until the UK sorts out its future trading relationship with the EU, it's very difficult to conclude an agreement with any third country, whether it's UK China or UK United States.
All right, actually, Professor Beg, I want to give you the last word because this is quite an interesting topic, a trilateral cooperation between China, the UK, and the EU. What are your thoughts on this?
I agree with what Fraser said, that the EU economy is still 6 times as big as the UK economy, and the UK is not particularly big exporter to China at the moment. The famous line is that the UK exports more to Ireland than it does to China. That's not going to change overnight, and I would say that the UK will want to join in what the EU does with China and have similar terms, but is not going to set the pace in the way that the EU will be able to do.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks for your insights on this topic. Gentlemen, Professor Ian Begg from LSE joining us over in London, Fraser Cameron for us in Brussels, and Mr. Cui Hongjian for us here in Beijing. Well, that's it for this edition of World Insight here on CGTN. For more in-depth analysis on the major stories driving headlines all around the world, feel free to visit our website. Just type World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. For everyone here on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world.